Hi and welcome to the Resolution and Noise Special Seminar. Now, I have covered these topics in numerous different forums, but I thought it best to consolidate all of the learning into a single seminar. So hopefully you'll learn a few new things as I go over these topics in greater detail. So without much further ado, let's get started. Let's take a look at the term resolution because it is a source of possible confusion, and the reason for that is we can apply the term resolution to three different areas of an imaging workflow. First off, let's look at image resolution, which we can measure in the pixels, how wide or how many number of pixels are in the width and how many pixels are actually in the height of our image. Now, we'll often hear, for instance, an image described as 1080p. That's 1080 pixels high. We can also see the resolution quoted in the number of megapixels or millions of pixels. And we also have the term pixels per inch, which is applied to an image when we're preparing it for print. Now, the second term resolution comes in when we're certainly in the print workflow, and that is dots per inch or DPI. And the third term is optical resolution. That's the resolving power of the lenses we're using. Now, premium quality lenses can capture more fine detail than maybe cheaper lenses out there. And the way of testing a lens for this is to measure pairs of lines or lines per millimeter. And we'll look at that in more detail again later. First off, PPI or DPI. Now, some people who are a little bit confused about resolution will often say DPI when they actually mean PPI. To give you an example, we might prepare an image for the optimum resolution for an inkjet printer at 240 PPI, and that is printed by an inkjet printer on average at 1440 DPI. So we certainly don't want to mix up those two terms if we can help it, and I'll give you a way of basically always referring to the right term over the next few slides. First off, PPI, that's pixels per inch. If we don't have enough pixels per inch when we're printing, we're going to see an image that looks like it's been taken from that computer game Minecraft. We're going to see the blocks or individual pixels, and we'll often refer to the image as being pixelated. If we increase the pixels per inch, then curves will appear a lot smoother and we'll no longer be able to see the jagged lines made up of those staircase of square pixels. So we'll get more detail and the image will appear sharper. Now, beyond a certain number of pixels per inch, we won't be able to see extra detail. And the limitations for that may be the printer, but it may also be the human eyesight to resolve extra detail in that image. So there are certain optimum resolutions where exceeding them, there is no point. Okay, let's move over to DPI. Now, DPI is dots per inch, and we can't force dots of ink to form squares. They naturally want to form dots. So that's a good way of remembering when we're talking about printer resolution, we're always talking about dots per inch. And when we're talking about image resolution, we're always talking about those square pixels or pixels per inch. Now, the third term there was the resolving power of our lenses. And of course, increased resolution will come with premium quality lenses. Now, these are measured by looking at the tangential lines and also the sagittal lines. And this is a standard way of testing a lens. And these will produce what's called MTF charts. Now, basically what they're doing is they're looking for good contrast between black and white lines, both in the center of the image and out towards the edges of the image as well. And of course, as we lose contrast or we lose definition, then you'll get a lower rating on that lens. Now, it's typical that lenses will perform much better in the center of the lens and less well at the outsides of the lens. Now, I'm giving giving you a link there where you can actually look at some MTF charts of created for Sony lenses by the independent company Lens Rentals. Here's a couple of MTF charts created for 135 prime lenses. On the left we have a G Master Prime, and on the right we have the Zeiss Batis 135. Now, of course, what we're doing on the left chart is we're measuring at the maximum aperture f1.8, and you can see it's performing slightly better than the Zeiss Batis, working at 2.8. Basically, the higher the lens is to the top of the chart, the sharper and better contrast we have. Now, we have a straight line and a dotted line, and that's because of the tangential and sagittal lines. One of those lines, the sagittal lines, will be the dotted line. Now, the closer those line pairs together, the smoother the bokeh as well. You can see as we move over to the right side of each chart, that is how the lens is performing right at the edge. And of course, we do expect some fall off of maximum sharpness when working at the edges of the lens. But remember, this is working at the maximum aperture, and we would get better performance by stopping the lenses down. So you can click on that top link, how to read an MTF chart there. And there is a YouTube movie where a guy will show you how you can read these MTF charts. Now, a word of warning, if you are looking at these MTF charts, you have to look at the same company making the MTF charts, because there is a variation of how many lines per inch. For instance, Sony will often only use 10 and 30 lines, not the 40 lines per millimeter or the 50 lines per millimeter. So of course we expect those lines to appear closer to the top. And you can see on that chart this time for the 50mm 1.2 how close those lines are to the top when we're stopping down to f8. So the sharpness will go all the way out to the edges as we stop down on this particular lens. Now, you might think that just purchasing a G Master lens is a guarantee that you'll get the best quality. Now, that is generally a good rule of thumb. Buying a G or G Master lens will certainly give you sharper images, generally speaking, but there are some surprises to be had. For instance, if we look at that 35mm f1.8, which is not a G or a G Master, it's actually performing really, really well wide open at f1.8. In fact, it's performing sharper than the G Master. The 85mm 1.4 G Master is performing wide open at f1.4. Now, those pairs of lines are a little bit closer together on that 85mm 1.4, so that will be the reason that 85mm 1.4 is giving that smooth bokeh in the out of focus areas. But certainly a bargain is to be had by looking at the MTF chart of that 35mm f1.8 lens. Now, if we are stopping down and we're looking at, say, that 35mm 1.4 and the 35mm 1.8, and we're stopping down here to f8, you would be hard pressed to see the difference in sharpness between these two lenses. And so for a lot of landscape photographers who are stopping down to f8 and f11, certainly the advantages of having that 35mm 1.4 are very limited. But as soon as we open up to the maximum aperture and we look out towards the corner of the images, now we can see the 35mm f1.4 G Master shining. We can see much greater contrast and fine detail right into the corners of the image, and we're actually working at a wider maximum aperture as well. So that is generally what you're paying for. You're paying for a better figure ground separation because of the wider aperture, but you're also paying for better corner performance when the lens is used wide open. Now, let's take a look at a depth of field calculator. When we want to measure sharpness, there's always that acceptable sharpness. That term acceptable sharpness creeps in because there's always some variables here, like how big is the image that we're looking at. Okay, at the viewing distance, are we a long way from the image or are we very close to the image? There's also the eyesight of the individual looking at the image. And of course, when we're looking at, say, a depth of field calculator on Cambridge and Colour, they're always very careful to use acceptable sharpness. And you can actually change the parameters of this by maybe using a smaller print dimension or a larger print dimension, and switching from the default manufacturer's standard eyesight to 20/20 vision. So again, that has to be factored in, is acceptable sharpness. Just because you can see the sharpness doesn't mean everybody else will be able to see the differences in sharpness that you're looking at. Let's move over to looking at an image here now. What I've done is I've use the crop marquee just to highlight a 3840 pixel wide image. Now these are the exact measurements of a 4K monitor, 3840 by 2160 pixels high. So when we zoom in, and this was captured with the 135 G Master, which is rated as perhaps Sony's sharpest lens, when we zoom in and look at that, we can see the wealth of fine detail at 100% magnification. 100% magnification means that for each monitor pixel, we're showing one image pixel. And this is where you're going to see the maximum amount of detail. There is absolutely no point in zooming to 200% or 400% because then you've got to sort of add imaginary pixels in between the actual physical resolution of the image. So that's the first tip that I'm going to give you, is don't zoom beyond 100% because the image will start to look softer, not sharper. So let's take a look at that 135 G Master again. And this is obviously if we're choosing a high resolution sensor, a sensor with more than 24 megapixels, we often want to shoot with premium quality glass so that when we zoom in, we are rewarded with fine detail. Now, if you're maybe shooting with a very cheap lens, not a Sony lens, now the individual fine detail may be lost. So yes, you might have a high resolution sensor, but you don't have a lens with a high resolving power to give you that fine detail that you need. We talked about a 4K monitor as being 3840 pixels wide, 2160 pixels high. This is an important measurement because for most people, we're not printing huge exhibition prints all of the time, but we want people to view our images in the optimum conditions on a 4K monitor. So if we measured the total number of pixels, that would be 8.3 megapixels. Now, most of us are using 24 megapixel sensors and more. And so you can see that it doesn't really matter beyond 8.3 megapixels how high the resolution of the sensor is, because the computer can only display 8.3 megapixels at any one time. The only way we're going to see more detail is if we have the option of zooming in. And that's not always an option given to us when we're viewing an image on social media. Now, the future might be 8K. 8K is double the width and double the height dimensions. So it's not 8,000 pixels as the name might suggest, it's just double 4K. So that's 7,680 pixels wide by 4,320 pixels high. That roughly equates to 33.18 megapixels. So that is a useful number to remember because we now have an A7 IV camera with a 33 megapixel sensor. So we're sort of future-proofing ourselves by going and selecting higher resolution sensors. Okay, and there's also another advantage over having a higher resolution sensor over maybe a 6K sensor, 6000 by 4000 pixels, or a 24 megapixel sensor, and we'll get into those advantages in future slides. Okay, so as we're viewing, this is an image from my Alpha 7 IV, and you can see the uncropped pixel dimensions. You do have the opportunity, of course, when working in Lightroom to press the I for information key and cycle through 2 levels of information. And one of those levels of information in Lightroom Classic is the cropped pixel dimensions. Because I haven't cropped this yet, you're seeing the full resolution of the sensor, 7008 pixels wide, 4672 pixels high. If we export an image for social media for 8.3 megapixels or 4K dimensions, we're basically going to discard 25 megapixels that are surplus to requirement. Okay, and that is an important thing to remember. Just because we have higher resolution sensors doesn't always mean that we're going to get extra fine detail, especially if we're not cropping aggressively. Okay, so if we take out a vertical image from this, now we're only going to be using 4 megapixels from our 33 megapixel, and 29 megapixels will simply be discarded when we export that 4K image. So let's take a look at pixels per inch for screen. Now, some people often want to refer to pixels per inch, even though their image is not destined for print. And this sort of is a mistake, because we should really only talk about image resolution if we're talking about screen viewing in pixel dimensions, width and height. So it really doesn't matter how big the monitor is. We're still going to be putting the same number of pixels on a 4K monitor, and that is the 3840 by 2160. Now the resolution will change. Obviously, the bigger the monitor, the lower the resolution, because of the increased dimensions in inches. So for instance, my BenQ 32-inch monitor has a resolution of 137 PPI. If you'd have selected the 27-inch monitor, you'd be seeing that same 4K image at 163 pixels per inch. Now, some people will often quote image resolutions in 72 or 96 PPI. Those are fairly meaningless if you don't know how big the screen is. So just get out of the habit of referring to screen resolution in pixels per inch, because it really is a meaningless number. We're really just looking at the pixel dimensions. Okay, so how many pixels are enough? Now I'm going to bombard you with a few numbers here, but you can always come back to this slide later. First off, Instagram. Now, I'm not a great fan of Instagram, and it always surprises me how many photographers use it, because we're looking at very low resolution images on Instagram. You can take a 4K image and you can upload a 4K image to Instagram, but Instagram just throws away all of the pixels surplus to requirement, because the maximum width in pixels for Instagram is 1080. Now, we might be able to go slightly higher, 1350 pixels high, but that is only giving us an image that is slightly less than 1.5 megapixels. To be honest, if I view an Instagram image on my large 4K monitor, it looks like a postage stamp. And if I zoom it to fit the screen, it just looks soft and out of focus. If we're looking at Facebook maximum supported dimensions, we have 2048 pixels on the longest edge. That is a little bit of an increase in resolution. So we're going up from that 1.5 megapixel Instagram image to 3 to 4.2 megapixels on Facebook. And for people who only have HD monitors, that's a maximum of 1920 pixels wide, that Facebook image is going to give you the optimum quality for fitting that large HD monitor. But of course, most people now are moving towards 4K monitors. Now, there is a social media site, of course, which does support much higher resolution. One example of this is the Flickr Pro. Now, if you just join Flickr and you don't pay Flickr for the money, you're only going to get that same resolution as Facebook. But if you pay Flickr some money to have a Pro account, you will have supported over 6,000 pixel or 6K images. The precise measurements that Flickr Pro supports is 6,140 pixels wide by 4,602 pixels high. That's 28.27 megapixels. Now, we don't have monitors with that high resolution. Well, most people don't have monitors with that high resolution, but it does allow people to zoom in closer to look at the fine detail when we have a member who is a Pro member uploading 6K images to their Flickr Pro account. Other resolutions for maybe smaller screens than we're dealing with these large desktop monitors is maybe those iPad Pros. This is the tablet, I think, with one of the highest resolution. I think Apple refer to it as a liquid retina. That word retina is often used because we can't see the individual pixels. Even if we've got our nose on our screen, the resolution is sufficiently high. So that 12.9-inch iPad Pro is 2,048 pixels high by 2,732 pixels wide. We don't need that 4K resolution because the screen is smaller. So we're looking at a 5.6 megapixel image for that iPad Pro. Now, this is an image that I'm showcasing on my Facebook site, where I've actually exported from Lightroom an image at the maximum supported dimensions by Facebook, and that is 2,048 pixels. Now, as I said, on a HD screen, which measures 1,920 pixels wide, that is more than enough to see a sharp image on that HD screen. But of course, we will be able to see more high definition if we choose to put that same image up to our Flickr Pro account. Now, if you are viewing a Facebook image on a 4K monitor full screen, what is actually happening here is the software or the web browser is just scaling the image up so it fits your screen. It doesn't have enough pixels there. It just stretches them out and adds imaginary pixels in between the image pixels, and so we get a slight softening of image quality when we're viewing a HD image on a ultra high definition monitor. So the answer to that is, if you want people to see the sharpest possible images, is we don't showcase our work on Facebook. We showcase our images on services that do support higher resolution images, and the one I've chosen is Flickr Pro here. So this is a 4K image which I've uploaded to my Flickr Pro account. If we click on the little arrows to go full screen, then of course I'm getting that maximum definition now, because the image I've uploaded is 2,160 pixels high, and there are 2,160 pixels high on the 4K monitor. So that stubble on this man's chin is going to appear as sharp as it is possible to see that. Now, if I'd have uploaded a 6K image, I would be able to zoom in on that image to see even finer detail. Okay, so here are a lot of figures now. There's a lot of screen resolution. There's a lot of jargon associated with screen resolutions. Right at the top there, we've got something that most people will never encounter ever again. We have VGA monitors, 640 by 480. We actually used to watch TV with as little information as that, a third of 1 megapixel. Slowly the resolution started climbing to SVGA, 800 by 600 pixels. The first iPads were 1080 or 1024 pixels. So those XGA was the term given to monitors that had that resolution, and we're still only at 3/4 of 1 megapixel. HD That's the is considered 1280 by 720. A lot of TV is actually broadcast at 720p. That's the height in 720 pixels. If we get close to a very large 4K TV where we're seeing images presented at 720p, they won't look ultra sharp. We need to back up further away for those images to look acceptably sharp. Now the next one down from that is quad VGA. Now I've listed this one because this is the term that Sony give the finder resolution on the new A7 IV. Now quad VGA, meaning it's got 4 times as many pixels as the VGA, that's 640 by 480. Okay, so but we're only looking at a 1.22 megapixel finder there, and the premium finders you will find on the Alpha 7R4 and the Alpha 1 cameras do have higher resolution finders than that. That middle line there in yellow, full HD, same as Blu-ray, is 1920 by 1080. Now we're seeing about 2 megapixels, and if you're far enough away from a screen, that will look acceptably sharp. The line below that one is QXGA, not to be confused with quad VGA. That QXGA is the sort of resolution that we're seeing on an Alpha 1 finder. We're now up to 3.14 megapixels. You have to make sure that the display quality in that finder is set to the highest setting, and you can't often have that when you've got a fast refresh rate. You have to choose between refresh rate and total number of megapixels. Below that we have cinema at 2048 by 1080 or 2.2 megapixels. A lot of laptop monitors come in at around the 2.5K for premium laptop monitors, or around about 3.68 megapixels. We then get 4K, which is certainly something that I recommend you do if you're into your photography and you want to marvel at the beauty of your high resolution images. You really owe it to yourself to be looking at 8.3 megapixels rather than 2 megapixels. And that is also the definition of Ultra HD Blu-ray. We then come down to IMAX Cinema, which is the same as 4K but slightly wider on the pixel dimensions. We're up to a whopping 8.84 megapixels now. And then of course there are some 5K monitors out there. Now for those people who get the 5K monitors, you will get a higher resolution image when you're sitting very, very close to your monitor. But you want to be wary of this. You don't want to be using a 5K monitor with a low spec computer, because Lightroom will struggle. We're jumping from 4K at 8.3 megapixels to 5K 14.7. We're nearly doubling the megapixels here, and that will cause Lightroom some issues on lower spec computers. So only use that 5K if you've actually spec'd out the computer to run with the fastest processors, the maximum amount of RAM that you can lay your hands on. Let's take a look at some resolutions now linked to print and monitors. Now, as it did say, that top line, item 72 PPI, you'll be very lucky to actually find any monitor that actually does fall into that 72 PPI. I think it's just a resolution that you really need to forget, for instance. Now, if you're working at a 55-inch TV or a 27-inch HD monitor, you're looking at a resolution of 82 PPI. There's that 96 PPI, which some people think is important for screen resolutions, but isn't. We're really interested in the width and height in pixels. Then we have my 32-inch monitor, which has a resolution, it's a 4K monitor, resolution of 137 PPI. That 27-inch 4K monitor has a slightly higher resolution, so it's definitely an advantage if you're sitting closer to your monitor. An inkjet print, 240 PPI. We can increase the resolution, but we might not see any more detail beyond that 240 PPI figure. and offset litho print if you're preparing images for commercial printing. The standard resolution to prepare your images for that workflow is 300 pixels per inch. They often don't appear any sharper than inkjet prints, but that is the traditional resolution for offset litho, which has a quite different workflow for printing than inkjet printing. Going back, right back to that important figure again, if you are going to remember one figure, it is those 4K dimensions that are 3840 pixels wide or 2160 pixels high. And eventually, I dare say, some of us will probably invest in 8K TVs before too long. And then the problem is where do we get the source images to feed to that very high resolution TV screen? Because it will take up pretty much all of your high resolution sensor. So we won't be able to crop very aggressively with the A7R 2, 3, 4 images before we don't have enough pixels to fill that 8K screen. Now, important figures when we're exporting an image, we will see on the dialog box on the left, this is Lightroom Classic. We're exporting, say, a JPEG image. We can choose the color space, sRGB or Adobe RGB, file quality. If the image is not going to be re-edited, 90 is high quality enough. And then we have the image resizing. If we're resizing this for Facebook, we'd put in the long edge 2048 here. If we're exporting an image for my Flickr Pro account, that would be 3840. Now, there is a box there, which is that yellow box. There is a resolution there, but this is only important if we're exporting images for print. And there is the default for an inkjet printer at 240 pixels per inch. Now, if you're exporting an image for screen, it doesn't really matter what number you put in that box. You could put 10 or 10,000. It wouldn't actually change the image size for presenting for screen, because it is that 3840 or 2048 or 1080. Those are the important pixel dimensions. Whenever I'm downsizing an image from my 33 or 42 or 50 megapixel sensors, and they're being downsized quite a long way, down to 8.3 megapixels, I will do output sharpening for screen, amount standard, because the images will lose a little bit of sharpness downsampling such a long way from, say, 50 megapixels to 8.3 megapixels. Okay, so that is an important second step, that sharpen for screen. And of course, there is an option for sharpen for print, and then you choose the paper surface, gloss or matte. Okay, on the export dialogues for Lightroom CC, you'll see they've dispensed with that resolution in pixels per inch. They're only really interested in the long side dimension or the short side. That short side dimension is very useful if you're exporting vertical images. Now, there isn't any point in exporting a vertical image at 3840 when the maximum height of a 4K monitor in landscape orientation is 2160. So you might want to select short side rather than long side in those instances. And as I said, all of the pixels that are surplus to requirement just get junked. So it really doesn't matter whether you're shooting with a 24 megapixel or a 50 megapixel sensor in these instances. It's a leveling playing field, because we're only exporting 8.3 megapixels for a 4K monitor. And that goes for the largest of screens. You might have a very, very large TV, but it's still displaying those 3840 pixels. And the only time that it would be a real advantage is if we're getting to those 70, 80 inch monitors. Then we might want to invest in an 8K monitor if we're showcasing our images on very large monitors and the viewing distance is very close. To be honest, if you sit this far away from your 8K monitor, it's a little bit of a waste of money, because the eyes won't be able to resolve the extra detail because we're sitting too far away to see that extra detail. And so you have to basically be sitting reasonably close to a 4K monitor to appreciate the extra quality above and beyond HD. So let's look at sensor resolution now. How much is enough? Now let's just take a trip down memory lane here. Now we will go all the way back to like 1991 for the very first DSLR, which was manufactured by Kodak using a Nikon body, all of 1.3 megapixels I think, and it was an extraordinary amount of money. And of course most photographers completely ignored the technology at that point because the resolution wasn't high enough and it was too much money. Things started changing around about the turn of the century here. So as we hit 2001, 2002, Nikon released their D1X with 5.3 megapixels. Now that might not sound a lot these days, but it was enough for many photographers to do a full page in a magazine using this type of camera. It was quite extraordinarily expensive for the era as well, 6,000 20 years ago, so that was certainly a lot of money back then. But this sort of really kick-started the digital revolution, and it was sensor that did it. Just a year later, Canon released their 1DS with a whopping 11 megapixels. That's even more than 4K. And of course, people now could start entertaining the idea of doing double page spreads in magazines. And of course, it also had good high ISO performance, which the Nikon APS-C sensor using a CCD sensor rather than CMOS sensor didn't really have that high ISO performance. A lot of people didn't jump on until the middle of that the 20s there. The 2006 Sony manufactured a 10 megapixel sensor that went into this Nikon D200 camera, and the price was certainly much more affordable. It made film look expensive once we factored in the fact that all we had to do for this camera was charge the batteries. So 10 megapixel sensor certainly saw many of the other people jumping on board. It was still a CCD sensor, so again the high ISO performance wasn't fabulous, but it was certainly good quality in the low ISO values here. And Sony really kick-started it for Nikon by manufacturing that 10 megapixel sensor. I actually owned the D200 and the Alpha 100, their first interchangeable lens DSLR, and they actually used the same sensor. The digital revolution blossomed and megapixel just started climbing and climbing and climbing. So here are the relative sizes of each of those major steps forward. Now we have that Facebook resolution, the smallest little white oblong there, 2004. 48 pixels. Then we have that darker 4K resolution, and you can see that 10 megapixels coming in there, just enough. Obviously there's a slight difference in aspect ratio, 3:2 to 16:9, but we certainly had enough megapixels now to start exporting 4K images. I think we predate 4K monitors around now, so certainly 10 megapixels was more of use in the magazine printing area rather than monitors, because monitors were pretty much still HD at that time. If we go up a box, we can see the relative size of 24 megapixels. Very generous if you compare that to the 4K is all we need to take that 8.3 megapixels from that total megapixel count of 24. Then we go up to the A7 IV, which is 33, the Alpha 1 at 50 megapixels, and the king of the resolution currently, the Alpha 7 R4 at 62 megapixels. So you can also see that some of these resolutions are quite close in relative size. So the difference between 50 and 62 is not huge, as you can see. It's a little bit extra, but not a huge significant difference there. Now, one of the big advantages, of course, with high resolution sensors is the ability not only to produce very large prints, but also to crop in camera and or in post-production. And this is the real advantage of high resolution sensors. So first off, let's take a look at a 4K crop from a 24 megapixel shooting in APS-C mode. This is where we only use the central portion of the sensor if you're using an APS-C lens, or we just want to only record at that lower megapixel count. We can see that it's a little bit tight. That 4K image, I don't really have enough to straighten this crooked image captured, this rodeo here. I don't have enough megapixels to create a straight crop and still have enough pixels to export that 4K image. So 24 megapixels is a little bit tight in APS-C mode for exporting 4K image. It's possible, but you really have to keep your levels pretty much right. Of course, as we moved forward above and beyond the 24 megapixels to 33 megapixels with the Alpha-7 IV, we can see that we can come down from that 7,000 pixel wide sensor into APS-C mode, and then that 4K crop is no longer tight anymore. There is a significant difference between the 4K dimension and the APS-C crop. So it is actually okay to crop in camera APS-C mode and then crop again in post-production and still have enough pixels left over for that 4K resolution. And of course, as we come in there, we're looking at a 2 times crop. Okay, we're only using about a quarter of the image here, which is that 2 times crop. And so once we then fill the screen with that crop, if we're using good quality lenses, we will be able to see rich, fine detail. And that is, of course, the importance of matching good lenses with a high resolution sensor. There's no point in cropping really tight and then just having slightly smudgy detail because the lens couldn't resolve the detail for us. And I'm happy to say that all of the lenses that I'm happy to promote always have that ability to resolve fine detail. And they're not always the G Master lenses, as I've said before. I'm a big fan of the 85mm f1.8 and 35mm 1.8. They're not G, they're not GM, but they are sharp, wide open, sharp enough to do these 2 times crop and still be pleasantly surprised when we see that information magnified, because now we're zooming in to fill a 4K screen. And of course, with that Alpha-7 IV, we can take out a vertical image, even if we've got a 4K monitor in vertical orientation, which is possible with some high-end studio monitors, is we still have enough resolution. You'll see the crop dimensions in the top left hand side here is we have 4150 pixels high. So even if we'd put our 4K monitor into vertical orientation, we could still fill that monitor with rich, fine detail. And of course, as we go up into the higher resolution sensors above and beyond the Alpha-7 IV, such as the R cameras or the Alpha-1 camera, we're now well over 8,000 pixels on the longest dimension. So as soon as we take out a 3,840 pixel wide image, we're taking out less than a quarter of the image for that 4K crop. So a 4K crop from an 8K sensor, and again we're getting that rich fine detail. This is that 135 G Master, and you'll also always be pleasantly surprised with how much fine detail there is even when shooting wide open on this 135 G Master. And again, going into, you can see the crop in that inset, you can see that red bounding box. That is the image that I'm taking from the full resolution sensor and then pushing out to the width of that 4K monitor. And so you're seeing how much resolution we're getting from that 50 megapixel sensor. And the huge advantage is not always that we can print very large prints, but we can indeed crop really quite aggressively and still have fine detail. Very important in a sporting context. If we've got our 200-600 lens but we're still not close enough, we always have the advantage on those high resolution sensors to crop again in post to get even closer. Okay, and you can see here with this vertical image of this racing greyhound here, that crop is still more than enough. I only need 2160 pixels in the height to fill a 4K monitor, and even when I've created the perfect composition complete with the dog's shadow underneath it, I still haven't come down. I could still crop even tighter than this. And you can see how much of the image area is being discarded. And this was captured with the 200-600. You are going to get a little bit of extra fine detail if you use the 400 or 600 G Master primes, but even the 200-600 is delivering on that fine detail, as you can see from these three images laid out as a triptych of racing greyhounds here. So here's a little chart showing the APS-C, which is a 1.5 times crop when we do that. Okay, so you can see on the 24 megapixel sensors on that top row there, if we shoot in APS-C mode, we're coming down to 10 megapixels. And as I said, if we then crop into the 16:9 aspect ratio, we are floating very close to that 4K bounding box there. We can't actually do a 2 times crop in post-production on those 24 megapixel sensors and still have a 4K image. We're down to 6 megapixels. We have the Alpha-7 IV. We can just about squeeze in that 2 times crop. It's a shade under, but probably enough in the height, if not in the width. We're down to 14 megapixels. Of course, the R2, R3 cameras at the 42 megapixel sensors, we've got a very generous 18 megapixels and 10.5 megapixels in the 2 times crop. The Alpha-1, now we're down to 21 megapixels, 12.5 megapixels in the 2 times crop. When I'm saying 2 times crop, you're actually emulating, if you double the focal length, you can actually, well, after cropping, it looks like you've been using, say, a 200mm focal length instead of a 100mm focal length. So we're getting that narrower angle of view by cropping in camera or cropping in post or cropping in both. In the Alpha-7 IV, we're down from 60 megapixels down to 26 megapixels. Very generous. There are many cameras that don't have 26 megapixels, even shooting full frame. And of course, in 2 times crops, we've got a very generous 15 megapixels, but I've colored that red. Now, the A7R4 doesn't have the highest high ISO performance, in my opinion. So if we're cropping in really aggressively, doing that 2 times crop, the images look great so long as we've kept the ISO at 800 and low. Otherwise, we can start dealing with noise, and I will start looking at that noise in the second half of this seminar. So the important note again, just a refresher, 4K, there are the dimensions, 8.3 megapixels is the total megapixel count. That 2 times crop, I think, is a huge advantage, and I think this is one of the reasons that I do like working with the higher resolution sensors. Yes, I'm happy to use some 24 megapixel cameras, but I certainly get more creative freedom when I'm working with cameras that do allow me that 2 times crop. So I'm going to show you an example here. On the left, we have the 85mm f1.8 shooting at aperture f2.8. And on the right, we've got the 35mm lens shooting at the maximum 1.4 aperture. Now I have to apply the crop to both the depth of field and also the focal length here. And so what we're doing is we're creating a very similar look to that 85mm, but I'm doing that by cropping with the 35mm prime. So if I have the opportunity to crop down using this, that 35mm prime gives me the flexibility of making it look like I'm maybe using a 50mm standard lens or even a 70 to 85mm short telephoto lens. So that is certainly the creative freedom, especially for me who likes working with primes instead of zooms, because if I want to zoom, I have to basically walk closer to my subject, step closer, or crop in post. So let's take a look at print dimensions. Now again, there's quite a lot of numbers here. The 24 megapixel sensors, if we're working at that inkjet optimum resolution, 240 PPI, I'm listing a maximum print dimension there of 25 inches by 16.66 inches. So this is when you're actually physically up close and personal to a print. We can get away with slightly lower printer resolutions if we step a couple of steps back. This is an important note. So if you're looking for prints that hold up when being viewed very closely, you will want that higher resolution, but it doesn't always mean that we're limited to these total print dimensions. Talk to your print service provider. You might be able to print larger, and really it does depend on those viewing conditions, you know, basically the eyesight of the viewer, how close they are to the print and how big the print is. So with 33 megapixels, we're pushing that out to 29 inches on the longest dimension, 33 inches on the 42.4 megapixel sensors. We're pushing out to 36 inches or 3 feet on the 50 megapixel sensors, and we're going 39 inches on the 60.2. Now that print dimension is sufficient once we got to 3 feet that most people are not viewing it at that close distance. Most people at a gallery opening or exhibition are standing a couple of steps back with a glass of red wine in their hand, and they won't notice if the print resolution is only 200 pixels per inch, not 240. Here are the maximum print sizes in the US dimensions, that D measurement there, 22 by 34. We certainly can hit that with the Alpha 1 and the Alpha 7R4, or the A1 in metric terms there. We can certainly hit that with even the A7R2, A7R3 cameras if we haven't cropped more than a little in post-production editing. So we can certainly hit those, and we might be able to go larger as I've described there. So some people might feel that they have to go up to medium format using those 100 megapixel sensors because they really want to be able to print 5 feet diameter prints at 194 PPI rather than 4 feet prints using the Alpha 7R4. But to give you an example that this isn't always critical, is I'm showing you some images that I had at the launch of the Alpha 7R4 in Singapore. These look like 6 feet high prints captured with the 62 megapixel sensor camera, and I have to say they stood up at quite close viewing. They did look remarkably fine in detail when viewed reasonably close. I'm not talking about putting your nose on the print, I'm just talking about getting close, a couple of steps away, maybe a step further back than where I'm currently standing to these prints. Now there are ways of growing the pixel dimensions without actually investing in medium format cameras, and of course anybody who owns the Alpha 1 or Alpha 7R cameras does have the option for pixel shift multi-shooting, and we can actually quadruple the pixel dimensions when we're working, or certainly double the pixel dimensions when working with the pixel shift multi-shoot. Here I'm shooting with 199 megapixels from the Alpha 1 sensor here. Now there are certain limitations. Basically, strictly speaking, the subject matter can't be moving because the capture is done in a sequence of images. But I do have a video tutorial where you can sort of get away with a little bit of movement if you're prepared to do a little bit of fancy footwork in Photoshop using layers. Okay, so there is also a new feature that Adobe released in 2021, and that is called Enhance Super Resolution. It first appeared in Adobe Camera Raw, but then was rolled out for Lightroom as well. So in some instances where maybe you're only using a 24 megapixel sensor and you've cropped very tightly, but you realize we no longer have that 4K resolution, do you abandon this as an image, or do you look at going and selecting the enhance option? When the enhanced dialog box opens, you check the super resolution option. This doubles the image resolution. Now, so if we're working, say, with an A7S camera with 12 megapixels, after Enhance has done its work, it will double the height, double the width. So we're actually quadrupling the total number of pixels to 48 megapixels from a 12 megapixel sensor. So do we get extra detail? And the answer to that is, if you are viewing this presentation on a 4K monitor, you would see now we do have that extra detail, all done through software rather than using higher resolution sensors and optimum quality lenses. I'm not saying that it's not worth paying the money out for higher resolution sensors or lenses, but we can certainly use software when we need to try and enhance the fine detail. So what I have on the left here is an image that was overcropped and then stretched to fit the height of a 4K monitor. And on the right side, we have the super resolution version. And if you look at the hairs on the top of the dog's head and you look at the detail around the eyes and mouth, you'll see that yes, we're getting some extra fine detail through software manipulation. Okay, and there is that hero image spread out over the 4K movie format now. So this might also be very important again if we're using, say, a 200-600G lens on a 24 megapixel sensor and the wildlife just didn't get quite close enough to what we would have liked. So again, we're finding that we're overcropping. So my workflow now would be, yes, and if we've raised the ISO, I would, first of all, I would increase the enhanced version without too much sharpening, and so that we can deal with the noise as a second step. So the first step would be just to use the super resolution to grow the file. I would don't normally use topaz denoise to denoise the total file size. I just export a 4K image and then use topaz denoise AI to work the noise denoise algorithms on that. And so here we are, we're denoising a 4K export after having played out the super resolution, part of the enhanced feature. And you can see now we're getting a really high quality bird in flight shot, where previously we might have thought we didn't have quite enough resolution, and we were also zooming in or magnifying the noise, so the noise was becoming slightly problematic. And as that denoise plays out, now we can see a super smooth background behind this falcon shot, and again that will go quite nicely up to a 4K full screen presentation. And there is a side-by-side view, so we've both dealt with the resolution aspect of this and also the problematic noise in the background. Let's move on to the second half of the presentation now, where we start looking at noise. Now, a lot of people will often ask the question, I'm finding my images very noisy, what have I done wrong, or what can I do differently? So this first image that I'm just showcasing here is an image captured in very low ambient light. The shutter speed is as slow as I dare go, and already the ISO has crept up to 8000 ISO. So if we look quite carefully in the background, which is where it's usually most noticeable, we can see the noise starting to become just a little bit problematic. Okay, so first off, one of the things you can do about noise is full frame sensors are better at dealing with noise than crop sensors. So the full frame sensors have better high ISO performance. Things that might start looking a little bit uncomfortable at, say, 1250 ISO, it doesn't really become really problematic for full frame sensors until maybe 2500 ISO. So we certainly have at least a one-stop advantage when we're looking at those full frame sensors, and that is certainly something to consider, especially if we're having to do birds in flight with very fast shutter speeds in less than bright conditions. We will fine noise becoming much more problematic on the APS-C sensors rather than the full frame sensors. And that is true if we go down from full frame through to APS-C into the micro 4/3 sensors that are used by Olympus and Panasonic. They will struggle with high ISO much earlier than the full frame sensors that we're using in the Sony cameras. Okay, zoom and crop also have a significant influence on what we're looking at. As we zoom into the image in post-production or crop tighter, we are going to be magnifying the noise. So the noise will start to look much more problematic. So what I'm showing you here is as we're zooming an image, which we're often wanting to do so we can look at the fine detail, we often zoom to beyond 50%. So in that image on the left, I'm zooming this motorcycle image to 50%. Now the height of that image in 24 megapixels is pretty much going to fit the 4K monitor on my 32-inch 4K monitor there. If I zoom more than 50%, yes, I can see the fine detail, but that really is only important if I'm intending on cropping much tighter in post-production. One would say, what is the point of zooming to 100% if we're not going to crop? And that is my first tip here, is don't over zoom an image in post-production and then start complaining about the noise if you're not going to crop the image in post-production. So that 50% zoom is usually enough if we're not cropping the image. If we take a look at the example on the right side, as we zoom to 50% and 100%, you can see we're actually going in much tighter on a smaller portion of the image. So we're effectively going in much closer to the noise on these much higher resolution sensors. So the first issue that most, say, Alpha 7R4 users say is, my images look overly noisy. You have to compare that to if you are zooming to 100% on a 24 megapixel image, the noise is actually much smaller at that same level of zoom. The first thing that I would often say to an Alpha 7R4 user is just don't zoom so close. In fact, why are you zooming to 100% at all if in fact you're not going to crop the image? So to give you an example there, when I'm viewing an image at 24 megapixels at 100%, I can show you the total image size. Obviously, a lot of people aren't going to have the ability to zoom when you post that image to share that image. Of course, if you looked at the total image size when we're zoomed into 100%, it's much, much larger than the physical monitor size, possibly 4 times larger. It gets even worse when we're looking at 100% on a 50 megapixel image. Is really, are you going to create an image that will fill your entire wall? Because that is what you're actually looking at when you're looking at 100% magnification. So you have to weigh this up. Is like, am I over zooming? Do I really only need to zoom to 50% to look at that fine detail? Because no one is going to see the image this large as a total image unless I print the image 6 feet wide and then have everybody stand very close to observe the noise. Okay, so here is the Flickr Pro 4K. Again, people will only be able to zoom in even closer is if I posted a 6K resolution image. So maybe then it would have been worth looking at maybe the 50 or 100% magnification if I'm going to start posting a 6K image to my Flickr Pro account. And of course, when we zoom in on Flickr Pro, they are going to see the 100% or 1:1 full detail. So in those instances, it's certainly worth zooming on a 6K resolution or a 24 megapixel sensor. But on a 50 megapixel sensor, possibly not. Still, 50% would be good enough on those particular images. So let's take a look at an ISO 4000 image captured with the Alpha 7 IV. This is the full width of the sensor. So we've got 7,000 pixels on the sensor being displayed on a 3,840 pixel wide. Now, if you look very, very closely at the background, you might start to just see that there's a little bit of noise there. Of course, if we're shooting in APS-C crop, the noise will be just 1.5 times larger, so it'll be more apparent if we're being shooting in APS-C mode because we couldn't get close enough to the subject matter. And if we're cropping even tighter in post-production to that 4K crop, we're going to get even closer to that noise. So the noise now is looking 2 times larger had we just exported the 4K uncropped image. So certainly the noise will start to look more problematic the more you crop in. Doesn't matter whether you crop in camera, crop in post, we're basically magnifying the size of that noise. So here is an image again with the Alpha 7 IV, full width of sensor, ISO 10,000. As we come into the APS-C crop, the 1.5 times, you might just start picking up the noise now. And again, coming into the 4K crop, the noise should quite clearly be visible to you now. Okay, so this is unprocessed. So of course we do have the opportunity to process these images. One of the other problems of when noise becomes looks worse than it actually is if we underexpose in camera and then raise the exposure in post-production. We're basically going to make that noise more visible by that workflow. So we should try definitely to avoid underexposure when we have raised ISO values. Let's take a look at the Alpha 7 IV image. Now everybody's going to be going, well, this is a high ISO image. I think this is 1250 ISO. It doesn't look problematic. But if we're viewing that in 100% view inside of Lightroom, people are going, oh, look, I've got a problem with noise. Well, not if we're exporting the 4K image. It's only when we've zoomed in. So you have to ask yourself the question, are people going to be zooming? And if you've only exported a 4K image, you're not going to give them the opportunity to zoom in this close to see the noise that you're seeing at 100% magnification. So I'd say if you are looking at fine detail, only zoom to 50%. Be careful with your sharpening. Don't over sharpen because it will sharpen the noise. Raise the masking linked to sharpening so that the noise in the defocused or areas of smooth continuous tone are not being sharpened. You are restricting the sharpening only to the edges. And so the noise will not be sharpened with those edges by raising that masking slider to maybe 70 or 80. And you can also do small amounts of global noise reduction. I don't tend to do higher than 15 or 20 global noise reduction. I will then use either localized noise reduction or use Topaz Denoise AI if I need to do more noise reduction. When you're exporting your images, 24 megapixel images are being shrunk, so they're only half the size when we're exporting 4K. But of course you're shrinking the A7R4 uncropped image 4 times in order to get down to that 4K image. So yes, noise may look problematic, but you're shrinking that noise proportionally more on a high resolution sensor than you are on a low resolution sensor. So here are the top tips. Is size of sensor. Just keep, if you do have an opportunity, go full frame rather than APS-C. If you can get closer using teleconverters, that might help rather than zooming in post-production. But remember, teleconverters will raise the ISO. So teleconverters make sense if we can get closer to our image at low ISO. We can use a program like Topaz Denoise. We can maybe use wide aperture primes instead of zoom lenses where the apertures are not so wide. We can also benefit by making best use of steady shots, so we can use slower shutter speeds, and in some instances we can use slower shutter speeds for creative purposes. So let's look at this. I've actually come in with a 1.4 teleconverter. This is a 4K crop from the A7 IV 33 megapixel file. Now I am helping the noise here because I am working at low ISO 250. The ISO would have been 125 without the teleconverter. So there is a reason to get closer here, so I'm having to crop less in post-production. When we're looking at cropping in post-production on an Alpha-7R4, things can get a little bit more difficult when we've raised the ISO, say, to 1000. 1000 is not a high ISO when we're working uncropped, but when we're working with a 4K crop from the sensor, noise can quickly become problematic. Whereas with an Alpha-7R3 sensor or an Alpha-1 sensor, we can often push that ISO maybe to 2000, 2500, and still get those 4K crops and keep the backgrounds relatively clean when we've done a little bit of work in post-production. So let's go back to that 4K crop from that 9K A7R4 sensor. You can see there is noise in the background, quite clearly visible before we've looked at that. So I've actually been shooting in APS-C mode and then cropped again in post-production. We're working with a maximum aperture of only f6.3 here, which has also made it slightly problematic because the noise is coming from that ISO 1000. So here I've worked Topaz Denoise AI and I've managed to clean up that background. A little bit of work, but I can get by with that Alpha-7R4 by cropping. Okay, a lot of bird photographers want to work with ISO values much higher than ISO 1000, and in that case, perhaps if you're having to crop aggressively or use teleconverters and raise the ISO, maybe the Alpha-7R4 isn't the perfect birding camera. You may have differences of opinion, especially if you're using maybe one of the GM prime lenses there. Okay, so let's look at the Alpha-7 IV ISO 16000 here. Okay, so this is, it's getting to sort of the top end of the comfortable zone now. So if I'm looking at a good workflow here, I will certainly want to do 80 masking on the detail here, so to make sure that I'm not over sharpening the noise. And of course we might push the noise reduction up to 20 as a global setting. If you push the noise reduction higher than 20, you are going to start losing fine detail. Say in the fur of this baby kangaroo here, you're going to start losing some of the fine detail there. If I'm going to do localized noise reduction inside of Lightroom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the AI technologies in the new masking features. Basically select subject, I'm going to invert the mask, and then I'm going to apply a very healthy noise reduction plus 100 to the background. Not to the subject because I will lose fine detail, but just to the out of focus areas where there is no fine detail. And I might even lower the texture slider as well, just to smooth out the bokeh in that out of focus area, which can become a little bit patchy with high ISO values. Now, I'm also a bit of a fan of Topaz Denoise AI, which I do find has a little better outcome than maybe select subject, invert mask, and apply noise reduction inside of Lightroom. Topaz Denoise has slightly better algorithms for working out where the subject is and applying noise reduction in a varied amount across the subject and the background. So here I'm going in with Topaz Denoise. Now, first off, it's made a small error. It doesn't always make errors, but occasionally it will confuse noise with maybe a fine texture in, say, fabric. If we look at the young girl on the right side, her woolen jumper there with the fine detail, the AI denoise algorithms have mistaken that fine textural detail as noise and has basically smoothed that. So there is an option to go in with a masking tool here and basically push back the detail that we've had here. You don't have to do this very often, just occasionally with a fabric texture it can be mistaken for noise. And again, you might also have to do that with fine detail in, say, feather or feathers if you find that happening. So here is a raw zero noise reduction. We're looking at the full image here, so we're not zooming in. high ISO noise reduction standard. This is if we're shooting in JPEGs. Basically, we can have the noise reduction applied in camera if we're shooting in JPEGs, and the cameras do quite a good job even with standard. This is, you know, quite a high ISO, 8000, but the camera has protected fine detail in the flyaway fur of the dog, and we've still got quite a clean background there. Some people say, you know, what is the better high ISO performing sensors? Is it the 24 megapixel sensors, or is it the new Alpha 7.4, or can we get reasonable high ISO performance, say from an Alpha 1? I think we're splitting hairs here. We're looking at an Alpha 1 image side by side at the same ISO 8000, and I think maybe the Alpha 7.4 image has a slight edge there, but with the 50 megapixel sensor we will be shrinking that noise more if we're not cropping aggressively in post. So it's a very we are splitting hairs. Again, if I zoom in to 100%, the noise might frighten you. But again, if we do some denoise in the background and we zoom out to a more modest 50%, we're not going to be frightened by that noise anymore. And certainly 50% magnification is more than enough magnification if we're not cropping tightly to a 4K image on these high resolution sensors. So ISO 8000, again, just some tips here. Default sharpening, don't raise the sharpening on your high ISO images. Mask the sharpening, 70 or 80. Zero the clarity. Clarity can also make the noise look worse than it actually is. So don't use clarity slider when using high ISO images. Denoise the background using in Lightroom or in Topaz Denoise AI, and only zoom your high resolution images to 50%. And that should give you these perfect outcomes even at ISO 8000 on this Alpha 1 camera. Now here's a side-by-side examples with Topaz Denoise compared to Lightroom noise reduction. If we have the image on the left, no noise reduction whatsoever. You can see the noise quite clearly in the background. Topaz Denoise in the center. If we look at the whiskers around the muzzle of this baby kangaroo here, you can see we've got a little bit more detail than in the Lightroom noise reduction. The select subject invert mask, it does have a tendency to lose the fine detail right on the edge. So slightly better outcome using the Topaz Denoise. It is close, but you will get a little bit of extra detail from Topaz Denoise at the moment. So I certainly have invested in that software, and there will be a link that you can download the software. I will get a small referral fee if you use that link, but no pressure there. Okay, so of course we go and look at the crop sensor cameras. APS-C, birds in flight, you will be leaning on Topaz Denoise a little bit more, especially if you're using the maximum aperture of f6.3 on that 70 to 350 APS-C lens. In full sunlight you will be getting reasonable results, but it is slightly more problematic. Certainly with sports photography, you will be noticing that noise a little bit earlier. Certainly working at ISO values of 2000 is slightly above the comfort zone for the APS-C sensors, in my opinion. But again, others might beg to differ there. Again, this is an APS-C image zoomed to 200%. Again, really, do we need to zoom that much if we're just looking at getting an idea of how much detail? So I would zoom out. Here's 100% zoom, which one might say is almost too much as well. But again, we're doing some localized noise reduction, this time in Lightroom, to that background. And already that image on the right is already looking much better there. 50% magnification, it's certainly looking more than acceptable now for an APS-C sensor, bird in flight. So again, we can frighten ourselves just by zooming in too much and doing nothing about the noise in post-production. So yes, I can pull off a 4K bird in flight. As long as the ambient lighting is relatively bright, I'm going to get good results from my APS-C camera. Next tip is to just move to using wide apertures lenses instead. So we certainly have at least a one-stop advantage on those 1.8 primes compared to using the 2.8 zooms. And you often save money by buying primes instead of zooms. You just have to do a little bit of more lens swapping if you've only got one camera body. One of the other things that I should mention about when working with high ISO images, we can be more tolerant of high ISO grain or noise if we convert the images to black and white. So here I am using an APS-C camera, the Alpha 6400, with a wide aperture prime, maximum aperture. Even then the ISO is still climbed to 2500, but converting to black and white was the final way of basically hiding the problematic noise, because we are more forgiving of noise in a black and white image compared to a color image. And of course, for sports photographers and bird photographers, moving to one of those wide aperture primes, the 400 2.8 or the f4 600, we are going to start halving or quartering the ISO values. So we are going to get much smoother, clean backgrounds when working with these wide aperture primes. But of course, they are a huge investment in money. Final tips is if we are using a very small sensors, such as we find in the RX10 or RX100 cameras, you might be finding yourself stopping down, because traditionally we do stop down to f8 or f11 for our landscape shots. But just remember, we get much deeper depth of field with these very small 1-inch sensors. So f4 is equivalent to f11 on a full frame equivalent sensor here. So there is very little reason to stop down beyond f4 on these RX10 or RX100 cameras, and that is the top way of keeping the ISO really low on these small sensor cameras. Moving on to steady shot. Of course, steady shot in a lens, especially a longer telephoto lens, is going to be very useful because the steady shot inside the stabilized sensors are really good for the wide angle and standard focal lengths, but we need additional support from steady shot in lenses if we're going to start using slow shutter speeds with telephoto lenses. So as we move out, this is the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization, doing a great job at 1/8 of a second. And here, well after sunset, I'm still hand holding at ISO 1000 on a full frame sensor and getting a really clean image here. Now I'm pushing it here, and you won't always get a sharp image, especially if the subject moves. But I'm showing you what would have happened if I'd captured with like 1/400th of a second at a 400mm focal length. I would have been shooting at 6400. But if the bird is absolutely motionless and I can hold the camera very still and use steady shot mode 1, I could, with great care, shoot this at 1/25th of a second at ISO 100. Now I'd always recommend shooting 2, 3, 4 images, because there is always the possibility that not every image using steady shot will be pin sharp, and you only have to have the subject move slightly at 1/25th of a second and you'll get subject blur, not camera shake but subject blur as well. So here's another example with an APS-C, which obviously less good at high ISO. If I'd just shot this at 1/125th of a second, I would have been shooting this at ISO 10,000, but I actually captured it at a focal length of 113mm at 1/8 of a second on the Alpha 6600 camera, which has the in-body image stabilization, compared to the Alpha 6400. So I'm getting a 4-stop advantage with the stabilization in the lens and the in-body image stabilization working as well. So I was able to shoot this at ISO 400 instead of ISO 10,000. Okay, then we've got the slow shutter speeds. Now in sport photography, we don't always need to freeze everything. If we have learned to pan reasonably accurately with our subject, we can start slowing the shutter speeds down from 1/2000th of a second, maybe to 1/500th of a second, and even slower. Each time we halve the shutter speed, we halve the ISO as well. So I can pull the ISO down by just shooting with slower shutter speeds. And we do get the creative movement blur. Now, people who are new to panning will lose a lot of images when shooting at these 1/250th of a second shutter speeds. You will find that the majority of your shots may be completely unsharp. You are looking for maybe 1 or 2 images in a sequence. But as you get better and more accurate with the panning, your hit rate will start to climb. If your hit rate is too low, just increase your shutter speed to increase the hit rate. Okay, and again with an RX10 we don't have the ability to freeze at 1/2000th of a second without using high ISO. So again, using those slow shutter speeds, we can keep the ISO down to 100 or 200 and make sure the noise is not problematic. And so I would typically only really do slow speed creative panning with these small sensor cameras. I wouldn't try to always freeze action at 1/2000th of a second. So that completes the resolution and noise seminar. Hopefully you've learned a few things about these interesting topics. Certainly they have generated lots of questions in the past, and maybe this will help resolve a few of those issues for you, and you'll move forward with a little bit more information, and that hopefully will give you a little bit more control and creative freedom over these workflows.